Strikes me there's a lot of this is about boundaries. So, whether it's sexual boundaries, bound at the moment everyone's obsessed with it was, Trump's wall and now it's ICE. The assertion of boundaries, which of course can be done too harshly. Just don't want to, say that. In people's lives, in the coaching world, everyone's obsessed with boundaries. They're like, that's my boundary. It's like society is setting no boundaries, so we have to do it individually,
That's
which is
right.
it's quite a big ask to invent relationships and to invent workplace. And so what's this obsession with boundaries that's going on at the moment?
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, you saw it. COVID was a great example of the question of asking where should you put boundaries, and because our world is so fragmented, we really struggle to notice how you layer boundaries, right? So we think in absolutes. We think either, you bring in all immigrants into your country, but wear a mask in order to protect yourself individually from everyone. There's this like weird obsession with that kind of excess, you could say. But the best way to do it, the normal way to do it would be to have layered boundaries, would be to have normal boundaries between individuals, then normal boundaries between families. And this would create a kind of balance. But because someone wants to live the way they want and they want to be able to do anything that they want, then all of a sudden, when that hits, then they become obsessed with boundaries and they have to, like you said, they have to be explicit, like say, oh no, this is my boundary. I won't do this. But in a normal world, you usually wouldn't have to, in a normal world where people are acting normally, the boundaries set themselves up organically all at every level.
Yeah, as someone that's learned boundaries through sobriety, for example, I kind of view the addict's and the child's view of freedom of I'll do what I want. And then, of course, that actually leads to sort of weird tyrannies and pushbacks and extremes. It seems like that's the lie of that version of freedom that's been sold.
That's a way to understand it, is that when you have excessive licentiousness or excessive freedom, then that leads naturally to a kind of tyrannical reaction, right? And so this is why, you talk about Sufism, this beautiful poem about the idea that if you keep the hand completely open or if you keep the hand completely closed, you're paralyzed. But you want the world to be this kind of gentle opening and closing of the hands, like the wings of a butterfly. You want that nice kind of balance. But if you say that an addict is a great example, the addict for too long wanted to do whatever they wanted. And then in that excess, in order to save themselves, has to put the strictest boundaries on their behavior that someone who never went as far in that direction wouldn't have to think of, wouldn't, to say like, I will not have one single drop of alcohol ever. That becomes necessary for an addict. But for a person that doesn't go in that direction, they can kind of manage that in and out. They can feel it. Oh, okay, I had 2 drinks last night, like maybe that's a little much, like, or 3 drinks or whatever. Like today I'm not going to drink anything. That's just like normal balance that happens in normal people.
And is there a risk that we swing from the kind of crazy liberal open, sort of at the last few hundred years have been increasingly liberal. So for listeners, I don't mean kind of Democrat or Labour Party or anything like that. And I think people's big fear is then that kind of gets asserted in a very strong way, whether that be Islam or the Handmaid's Tale, which almost seems like a fantasy sometimes. I've seen there's a weird quality of calling in something that looks really harsh.
Yeah.
Or the actual far right, as opposed to the British government's version of the far right, inverted commas. So, is there a sort of a risk of a swing the other way?
Of course. Yeah, of course. You see it in the 20th century from Weimar to the Reich is probably the clearest example of this swing, where in some ways a kind of fragmentation, breakdown of society and a type of moral licentiousness that was out of control a led to tyranny. And so I don't see that's why I always talk about this where when I look at the woke stuff and I'm thinking, this is very dangerous, not just for itself, but also because what it's going to call out is going to call out some kind of like tyrannical reaction to the woke stuff. And so that's why we advocate for subsidiarity and a kind of natural order of things where we find we don't let ourselves go in these excesses in none of the places in our life. We try to find this kind of natural balance.
I'm a bit obsessed with your work on the post-World War II consensus. I mean, that seems to be. Would you like to summarize that briefly for listeners? I think it's really relevant to many issues today.
Yeah, well, one of the things that's going on now is in some ways because the boomers are dying, the people that obviously the people that were in the war, the people that had witnessed the war, that had knew people that were in the war are kind of going away. There's a kind of natural progression where that story, the story that's been holding us together since World War II, is collapsing. And it's collapsing in all kinds of ways. One of the things that happened at the end of World War II is that in some ways we had a devil, Hitler, pretty clear, and and then we were the good guys. We liberated Europe. We were the good guys in the war, but there was a kind of secret in that winning, which is that we had partnered with the devil, with Stalin, in order to win the war, and that secret was kind of held at bay. We didn't really talk about it. We continued to portray the fascists as the most evil. And although we did believe the communists were evil, they weren't as evil, obviously. And you know that because you can walk around with a communist flag all day and nothing will happen to you. But if you walk around with a Nazi flag, people will literally attack you in the street, which is shows you kind of what happened. And so, but that let's say that order is somewhat breaking down because it is related to excess. Think about it this way. So Nazis loved identity. They loved this idea of they said like strong borders, solid hierarchy. Everything was like that's why they were called the Axis, right? It's like there's an Axis and then there's the allies that all gather around to fight the Axis, right? The imagery is perfect, and and then the Allies were like this ragtag group of people that don't have a centralized government that were diverse and took down the Axis. Now that's a story, and it's a very legitimate story. Sometimes identity becomes tyrannical, and you have to kind of take it down. But if you play that story for too long, at some point it starts to become excessive. So at first you say, obviously fascism is evil, right? But just nations are kind of like identities too, right? So ethnostates, they're kind of fascistic. They must be also fascist. And then actually not just ethnostate, but just nations. Nations themselves, they have borders and they have centralized power, so they must be fascistic too. And then you go, oh, wait, families. Look at families. Like families have like a father and a mother and children, and there's these and so you end up devolving the idea of the axis all the way through society to a point where it just doesn't hold anymore. You can't oppose the family, like you can't oppose
Yeah, the
nations.
gym is far right. The Guardian had an article going to the
Exactly.
gym is
Anybody
far
who
right.
wants discipline, anybody who wants to manifest any kind of masculinity is fascist.
Masculinity, right? I
Yeah.
mean, in terms of demonizing men and the young guys who listen to the podcast who feel this is the root of it, is the demonizing of borders, boundaries, hierarchy, masculinity.
Yeah, and
But
even
that's sort of
if
played
you love
out.
your history, you are necessarily a fascist. If you're just happy to be part of a lineage, like you're obviously fascist. So all of that, obviously, at some point that can't hold, and especially as the opposite becomes more prominent, where you have this idea that you can be anything you want, that you can be a cat, that you can be a wizard, that you can be any gender that you want, you can be whatever you want. That starts to break down, and so I think that's what we're seeing. In some ways, we're kind of seeing this story reach such an excess that it's just not tenable. And people are like, well, you know what? You want to say I'm racist? I don't care. Fine. Say I'm racist. You want to say I'm fascist? Fine. I don't care. Like, I can't fight this anymore. I can't tolerate this insane, this like excess of diversity, you could say. But diversity is good. We need diversity. Obviously, the world is made of unity and diversity, but you can't just have one. You can't just say
Right.
diversity. If you say diversity is our strength, like my former prime minister, without unity, diversity is called decomposition. That's what diversity is without unity, and therefore you have to balance the swing between unity and diversity.
Yeah, if you look at it in terms of borders and openings, skin has to have ears and eyes and mouth and holes in it. If it was all whole, it wouldn't be a skin. If it had no holes, it wouldn't be useful either. Just on the biological level, a cell has borders and barriers. It lets things in and out, but it's not too open, not too closed. This makes sense to me. And I think in a way, the reason I'm not like super depressed and angry about this is the women. I noticed a year or two ago, women at different demonstrations, or mums would come to me quietly and say, "Hey, Mark, like I want to be kind and I'm not a racist, but I think this has gone too far." Like hippie mums would come to me and they'd
Mm.
be concerned. Say, I went along with it a few years ago and I, used pronouns, but now the people who are like doulas, they're kind of like hippie midwives would come to me and say, this is forcing into our space. And particularly when the kind of kids started to be threatened. And as
Yeah.
soon as the mums were on board, I went, okay, this has already turned. I don't need to worry about this anymore. I don't need to shout.
Yeah, don't wake up mama bear. That's a very dangerous thing. And so, the feminine archetype or the feminine image, in some ways, it is always naturally geared towards compassion, right? And it kind of has to because infants need compassion. Children need compassion. They're fragile. You have to help them, and so there's a general tendency to kind of extend that compassion also to even to the weak aspects of society or the stranger. And so this is a natural thing that women and the feminine kind of does, but it has to be balanced out. Like you can't just have absolute compassion for the stranger because sometimes that's an invasion. Sometimes when there are too many strangers on your border that are coming, it's called an invasion. And so you have to be able to discern the difference between like normal openness and hospitality towards those from the outside, and at the same time, the you could say, and the same with like the gender stuff. It's like we understand that there's variation. Everybody knows that like nobody totally fits the mold of sexual things. Like everybody has their quirkiness, everybody has their thing. And so we kind of want to have compassion for that. But there's an excess to that compassion, right? When that compassion leads, people to cutting off a 15-year-old's breasts, and then giving a young, a prepubescent boy hormones to the point where they end up with a micropenis and like are literally ruined for life. That's different. That's like a level of compassion that reaches into kind of insane monster level compassion.